At my father's funeral wake, my sister Claire leaned toward me and said, "The house is mine anyway. Start packing." I looked at her and wondered how she could say that while Dad's photographs were still on the table behind us. How could she be so certain about a house she had never legally owned? And why had Dad told me just months before he died, "If anything happens to me, wait for Evelyn. Don't sign anything. Don't promise Claire anything." I had almost forgotten those words. Almost. Because Claire didn't know about the trust. She didn't know what Dad had changed 6 months before his death. And most importantly, she didn't know what he had written about her. I wish I could tell you that Claire's words at the wake were the first time I realized she believed the house belonged to her. They weren't. Looking back, there had been signs for years. I had simply gotten very good at explaining them away. Claire was my older sister, and for most of our lives she had been the one who stayed close to Dad. I had moved away for work in my 20s, built a life of my own, and learned to live with the guilt that comes with not being able to show up every Sunday, every birthday, every ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Claire never let me forget that. Whenever Dad needed something, she was usually the person people saw. He drove him to the hardware store. He helped with the yard. She arranged contractors when the roof needed work. She knew which drawer held his insurance papers and which cabinet he kept his coffee in. And I appreciated that. I really did. What people didn't always see was what I did from a distance. I handled the paperwork when Dad's insurance company made a mistake. I spent hours on the phone with his doctor's office when his medication was changed. I paid bills when he was too tired to sit at the computer. When he was hospitalized, I drove through the night more than once just to sit beside his bed. But those things weren't visible. Claire's sacrifices happened in front of everyone. Mine usually happened quietly. And maybe that's why, little by little, she started believing she had earned something more than the rest of us. The house had belonged to Dad for decades. It was the place where I had grown up, where Claire and I had fought over bedrooms, where Mom used to make Sunday breakfast before she passed away. But after Mom was gone, Claire began talking about the house differently. At first it was harmless. She would say, "I'm going to repaint this room someday." Or, "When I fix the kitchen, I'll finally get it the way I want." I never corrected her. Then the words changed. She started saying, "When Dad's gone, I'll stay here." I remember hearing that one afternoon and feeling something tighten in my chest. I asked her what she meant. She laughed. "Where else would I go? This has always been my home." I could have argued. I said nothing. That was my mistake. Because silence can look a lot like agreement when someone already believes they are entitled to something. As Dad's health declined, Claire became even more certain. She started discussing repairs with contractors without asking him first. She talked about what furniture she would keep. She even mentioned to one of our cousins that she planned to take care of the property after Dad was gone. I noticed all of it. But I still didn't confront her. Then about 6 months before Dad died, he called me late one evening. His voice sounded different. Tired but deliberate. He said, "Sailor, if anything happens to me, there's something you need to know." I sat down on the edge of my bed. And what he said next was the first clue that the house, and my sister's certainty about it, wasn't what it seemed. I didn't understand what Dad meant that night, and when I asked him to explain, he became unusually quiet. He said, "There's an attorney named Evelyn Grant. If I'm not here, wait for her." That was it. No explanation. No dramatic warning. Just those few words. I remember asking, "Dad, is something wrong?" He told me not to worry. But I knew him well enough to hear what he wasn't saying. Something was wrong. So I didn't push him. I wish I had. Over the next few months, Claire became even more confident about the house. She started referring to it as though the ownership had already been decided. One afternoon, I was standing in the kitchen when she walked in carrying a folder. She dropped it on the counter and said, "I've been looking at the property taxes. They're going up again." I asked why she was looking at them. She gave me a strange look. "Because I'll be dealing with them eventually." I didn't respond. She opened the folder and started talking about repairs she wanted to make after Dad was gone. I remember standing there listening to her and thinking about that phone call. Evelyn Grant. Wait for her. But I still didn't know why. Dad passed away 3 months later. And suddenly, every unfinished conversation between us became permanent. The funeral was difficult in ways I hadn't expected. I thought I would be prepared because we'd known his health was failing. But knowing someone is sick and knowing you will never hear their voice again are two completely different things. After the service, people gathered at the house. The same house Claire had been talking about for months. There were casseroles on the kitchen counter. Coffee everywhere. Family members speaking quietly in the living room. Old photographs sat beside flowers that people had brought. And Claire moved through all of it like she was already the person in charge. She told people where to put things. She answered questions nobody had asked her. She even started discussing what needed to be done with Dad's belongings. I noticed. But I was too tired to fight her. Then she came toward me. She lowered her voice and said, "We should talk about the house." I looked at her. "What about it?" She sighed, almost as if I were making something unnecessarily complicated. "The house is mine anyway." I stared at her. She continued, "Dad always said I'd have it. I've lived here. I've taken care of it. You have your own life somewhere else." There were two relatives standing nearby. They heard every word. Claire looked at me and smiled. Then she said the sentence that I knew I would remember for the rest of my life. "Start packing." For a few seconds I couldn't speak. Not because I was afraid. Because I was trying to understand how someone could be that certain about something they had never actually seen on paper. And then I remembered Dad's voice. "If anything happens to me, wait for Evelyn." So I looked at Claire and said quietly, "You should probably wait before you start making plans." She frowned. "Why?" I didn't answer. Because for the first time I was beginning to understand why Dad had made that strange phone call. And just then someone knocked on the front door. It was Evelyn Grant. The woman standing at the door was older than I expected, probably in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled neatly behind her ears and a dark leather folder tucked under one arm. She looked around the room once. Then her eyes found me. "Sailor." I nodded. "I'm Evelyn Grant." Claire had gone completely still. I could see the change in her face before Evelyn even said another word. Claire knew that name. Not well, apparently, but enough to understand that this wasn't a casual visit. Evelyn stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said to me. "Thank you." Then she looked at Claire. "Are you Claire?" Claire nodded slowly. "Yes." Evelyn glanced toward the relatives gathered in the living room. "I think it would be better if we spoke privately." Claire immediately said, "There's nothing private about the house." The room became quiet. I remember thinking how strange that sentence sounded. Dad had been dead for only a few hours, and already the house had become the center of everything. Evelyn didn't argue with her. She simply said, "Actually, there's quite a lot that needs to be discussed." Claire folded her arms. "I assume you're here because of Dad's will." Evelyn looked at her for a moment. "Yes." Claire's expression softened. She almost smiled. "I thought so." Then she looked at me. "You heard me, Sailor. Dad made it clear." I said nothing. Because I still didn't know what Dad had done. I knew only what he had told me that night. "Wait for Evelyn." Evelyn placed her folder on the dining table. "I'd like everyone who needs to be involved to sit down." My aunt moved toward the kitchen. One of my cousins quietly took the children into another room. Claire remained standing. She looked irritated, as though this meeting was an unnecessary delay before she could receive something she already considered hers. Finally she sat. I sat across from her. Evelyn opened the folder. "The first thing I need everyone to understand is that your father had an older estate plan." Claire nodded immediately. "Yes." "The will." "Yes," Evelyn said. "The will." Claire looked at me. "Dad told me about it." Something about the way she said it made me uncomfortable. Not because I was surprised. Because she sounded relieved. Evelyn continued. "That document was valid at the time it was created." Claire leaned forward. "So the house goes to me." Evelyn didn't answer immediately. And that pause changed everything. Claire's smile disappeared. Evelyn reached into the folder and removed a document. "Your father changed his estate planning 6 months before his death." Claire blinked. "What do you mean changed?" "I mean that the will you are referring to is not the document that controls the ownership of the house." Claire stared at her. I felt my stomach tighten. Evelyn continued in the same calm voice. "Your father established a revocable living trust." Nobody spoke. I had heard the words, but they didn't immediately mean anything to me. I looked at Evelyn. "A trust." She nodded. "Yes." Claire shook her head. "No." Evelyn looked at her. "Yes." Claire's voice became sharper. Dad would have told me. Evelyn didn't respond to that. Instead, she opened another section of the folder. The property at this address was transferred into the trust 6 months ago. Claire's face changed. I remember watching her as if I were watching someone realize they had walked into the wrong room. She looked at me. Did you know? No. She didn't believe me. You expect me to believe you didn't know? I didn't. You're lying. I'm not. Evelyn raised one hand. Neither of you needs to argue. Claire turned toward her. Then who gets the house? Evelyn looked directly at me. The trust names Sailor as the beneficiary of the property. I stopped breathing for a second. I actually thought I had misunderstood her. Me? Yes. Claire pushed her chair backward. No. Her voice wasn't loud. It was almost a whisper. No, that's not possible. Evelyn closed the folder halfway. It is possible and it is documented. Claire stood. Dad promised me that house. Evelyn nodded. I understand that you believed that. Believed. Claire laughed once, but there was no humor in it. He told me. He said I would always have a home here. I looked at her. And for the first time I understood why she had been so confident at the wake. She wasn't pretending. She genuinely believed Dad had promised her the property. Evelyn reached into the folder again. There is an older will that may contain language consistent with what you're remembering. Claire looked relieved. There. You see. But, Evelyn continued, that document was superseded. Claire's relief vanished. By the trust. Yes. She shook her head. Why would he do that? Evelyn looked at me. Then back at Claire. Your father wanted to make a change to how the property would be handled after his death. Why? Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Instead she took out another envelope. It was cream-colored. My name was handwritten across the front. Sailor. My hands became cold. I knew immediately what it was. A letter. From Dad. I stared at it for several seconds. Did he write this? Yes, Evelyn said. When? Shortly after the trust was finalized. Claire stepped closer. What does it say? Evelyn held the envelope out to me. That is for Sailor. Claire looked at me. Her eyes were no longer angry. They were frightened. And somehow that frightened me more. Because until that moment I had been thinking this was simply about a house. But now I understood something. Dad hadn't just changed his estate plan. He had expected this exact moment. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Dad's handwriting. The same handwriting I remembered from birthday cards, grocery lists, and the little notes he'd leave on the kitchen counter. My eyes moved across the first few lines. And then I reached a sentence that made my heart stop. He wrote, Sailor, if you're reading this, Claire has probably already told you the house is hers. I looked up. Claire was staring at me. Neither of us spoke. I looked back down at the letter. The next sentence was even harder to read. Please don't mistake her certainty for the truth. I felt tears gather in my eyes. Dad had known. He had known exactly what Claire would say. Exactly what she would believe. And suddenly that strange phone call from 6 months earlier made sense. If anything happens to me, wait for Evelyn. I hadn't understood it then. I understood it now. Dad had been preparing for a conversation he knew he wouldn't be alive to have himself. And whatever was written in that letter was going to explain why he had chosen me. But before I could read the rest, Claire reached across the table. Sailor, she said quietly. I looked up. She wasn't yelling anymore. She wasn't threatening me. She simply asked, what did Dad say about me? I looked down at the letter again. And for the first time since the funeral began, I realized the house wasn't the real secret. Dad had left behind a reason. I looked at Claire for a long moment before answering. I haven't finished reading it. That was the truth. But Claire didn't seem willing to accept it. She pulled her chair closer to the table and stared at the envelope in my hands. What did he mean by that? She asked. Why would he write my name in a letter like that? I didn't know. So I looked back down at the page. The handwriting became slightly uneven as I reached the next paragraph. Dad had written that he knew Claire believed the house would be hers. He said he understood why she believed it. He remembered telling her that she would always have a home there. But then he wrote something that made my chest tighten. A home is not the same thing as ownership. I stopped reading. Claire noticed. What? I swallowed. He said you would always have a home. Her expression changed immediately. That proves it. No, Evelyn said quietly. Keep reading. I did. Dad explained that over the final year of his life, he had begun noticing how often the conversation returned to the house. Who would live there? What repairs needed to be made? What it would be worth? What would happen to it after he was gone? He wrote that at first he hadn't thought much of it. Then he began noticing something else. Claire had started treating decisions about the house as though they were already hers to make. My eyes moved slowly over the words. Then I reached the part that made me stop completely. Dad had written that he had kept copies of several financial records because he wanted everything documented. Not because he wanted to accuse Claire. Not because he hated her. Because he didn't want a disagreement between his daughters to become a battle over memories. Evelyn quietly placed another folder on the table. These are the records your father asked me to keep. Claire immediately stiffened. What records? Expenses related to the property. Claire shook her head. I paid for those things. Evelyn nodded. Some of them. Claire looked at me. I replaced the furnace. I know. I paid for the roof. I know. I spent years maintaining that house. I know, Claire. Her voice became sharper. Then how can you sit there and act like I didn't earn something? That question hurt more than I expected. Because underneath all her anger I could hear something else. Fear. She wasn't just afraid of losing a house. She was afraid that everything she had done for Dad would suddenly mean nothing. I closed the letter. I never said you did nothing. Then what are you saying? I looked at her. I'm saying Dad made his decision. Claire shook her head. No. You manipulated him. The accusation landed hard. I stared at her. I didn't even know there was a trust. You expect me to believe that? Yes. She turned toward Evelyn. Was Sailor involved in creating it? No. Did she speak to you about changing Dad's estate? No. Did she ask you to make her the beneficiary? No. Each answer made Claire quieter. Evelyn then placed the trust document on the table. The document was signed properly. Your father was evaluated by his physician shortly before the signing. There were witnesses. Everything was completed according to his instructions. Claire looked at the papers. Then she said the words I knew were coming. Dad wasn't himself near the end. My heart sank. Not because I believed her. Because I knew where this argument could go. Evelyn's expression remained calm. We have documentation addressing that concern as well. Claire looked at her. What documentation? Evelyn opened another section of the file. Your father's medical records and the attorney's notes from the signing. The room went silent. Claire stared at the papers. For the first time she seemed to understand that this wasn't something she could simply argue away. Then she looked at me. So that's it. I didn't answer. She pointed toward the trust. You get the house because Dad changed one document behind my back? I looked down at his letter. Then I looked at my sister. No, Claire. My voice was quieter than hers. I get the house because Dad chose what he wanted to happen to it. She stood there breathing hard. And then she said something that I knew would change the rest of the conversation. If you take that house from me, Sailor, I'm going to fight you for it. I looked at Evelyn. Then back at Claire. And for once in my life I didn't feel the urge to make everything easier for everyone else. I simply said, then fight me. And Claire's face went completely still. Claire's face stayed still for several seconds. Then she picked up her purse. Fine, she said. If that's how you want this to go, I'll get my own attorney. She walked toward the door but stopped before leaving. You're going to regret this. I wanted to tell her that I already regretted plenty. I regretted staying silent when she first started talking about the house as though it belonged to her. I regretted every time I let an uncomfortable conversation end with me saying, it's okay, when it wasn't. But I didn't say any of that. I simply watched her leave. When the door closed, the house became strangely quiet. Evelyn looked at me. You don't have to decide everything tonight. I know. But you should read the rest of your father's letter. I nodded. After everyone left, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The same table where Dad used to drink his coffee every morning. I opened the letter again. The next paragraph was difficult to read. Dad wrote that he didn't want me to think the trust meant he loved me more than Claire. He said that wasn't why he chose me. He chose me because he believed I would understand that owning the house meant accepting responsibility for it. Then came the sentence that broke something open inside me. Claire has spent the last year asking what happens to this house when I die. You have spent the last year asking whether I'm comfortable, whether I've eaten, and whether I need anything. I covered my mouth with my hand. I hadn't realized how much Dad had noticed. I kept reading. He wrote that Claire had been a good daughter in many ways, but somewhere along the way, fear had changed her. She had become afraid that if she didn't secure the house, she would have nothing. Dad said he didn't blame her for wanting security, but he couldn't allow his fear to become someone else's entitlement. Then I reached the final part. He wrote, "If she tells you the house is hers because she stayed, remember this. Staying near someone is not the same as caring for them, and caring for someone does not mean they owe you their property." I couldn't continue for a moment. I stared at those words until they blurred. As suddenly I understood. Dad hadn't created the trust to punish Claire. He had created it because he knew his death would bring out a fight neither of us was prepared for. The next morning, Claire's attorney contacted Evelyn. The call lasted nearly an hour. There was no miracle loophole. The trust was valid. The property transfer was recorded. The documents were properly signed. Claire had no automatic ownership simply because she had paid for repairs. But she wasn't willing to accept that. She wanted one final meeting. This time I agreed. We met at the house a week later. Claire sat across from me with a folder of receipts. She placed them on the table one by one. Roof, furnace, plumbing, property taxes, maintenance. "I paid for all of this," she said. I looked at the receipts. "I know." "Then tell me how that's fair." I took a breath. "Maybe it isn't fair that you spent money believing Dad would eventually give you the house." She looked up. But Dad never gave you ownership." Her eyes filled with tears. For the first time the anger disappeared. "I thought that was what he wanted me to have." I nodded. "I know," she whispered. "I thought I was his daughter too." That sentence hurt. I reached across the table. "You are." She looked at me. "But being his daughter doesn't mean either of us gets everything we want." Neither of us spoke for a while. And then I finally understood what Dad had been trying to leave me. Not a house. A choice. And this time I was going to make it without sacrificing myself just to keep everyone comfortable. For a long time I thought keeping the peace meant staying quiet. I thought saying yes made me a good daughter, a good sister, a good person. But Dad's letter taught me something I wish I had understood years earlier. Love without boundaries can slowly turn into entitlement. Claire thought the house was hers because she had stayed. Dad saw something different. He saw who respected him while he was still here. And maybe that's the question worth asking yourself. Are you protecting your peace or simply protecting everyone else from your boundaries? If this story meant something to you, subscribe. There's another one waiting for you.